This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you for coming. Of course, our chair is actually not able to be here today, so I'm afraid I'll have to give the introduction. Nobody more illustrious stature than myself. I'm Michael, the seminar convener, and today our speaker is Elizabeth Crawford, who I'm sure needs no introduction, who's an independent researcher who's done some fascinating research into a primary source she's uncovered, the voluminous and detailed diaries of a suffrage activist, Kate Fry. While she begins, I'm going to be sending around our register. If you could all sign it for me, we'll demonstrate to the IHR exactly how popular we are. And of course, as some of you may know, if you've seen our website, we've got quite a few seminars coming up this term. All the details are on our website. If you'd like to be a member, I've got some forms, conveniently right here. You can either fill this out and get it back to us later. But anyway, I suppose for now, I will just turn over to Elizabeth if you want to get us started.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just plunge straight in and say that Kate Fry was born in 1878. She was the younger daughter of a man who started off one of the first chains of grocery stores in England. And in the 1890s, he involved himself in politics and became North Kensington's radical Liberal MP. He went in 1893 on the same intake as Keir Hardie. The Frys lived a comfortable middle-class life. They rented one large house in North Kensington in All Saints Road at this time, which was actually there was the flat above the grocery store, but they later moved to a much larger house, once it became an MP, in fact, and near Ladbroke Grove. And they also rented another house on the banks of the Thames at Bourne End, which was very fashionable late 19th century boating area. And like so many other girls of her class, Kate never went to school, and she received genteelly inadequate teaching from a succession of daily governesses. I mean, the lessons were just a couple of hours, possibly in the morning, and they stopped before she was 16. She bitterly regretted this lack of education. She was a thoughtful reader and a committed writer of plays. I've got a box of them. Most of them were unpublished. In fact, only one was published. And of her diary, a writer of her diary. For Kate was a diarist par excellence, and she composed entries every day, decade after decade, until October 1958, which was just, I think she must have had a stroke the day after, so she died a couple of months later. And she'd begun keeping a diary when she was 8, although it really only picked up perhaps when she was 13, and then they became quite lengthy and at times extremely lengthy entries. And by luck, her diary and a large quantity of associated ephemera has survived, and it was sitting there waiting in a soaking wet cellar in North London until fate, and in fact retiring, or at least the leaving archivist at the Women's Library, took a hand and directed my footsteps there. And I was just immersed once I started reading. And during the main years of the 20th century suffrage campaign, Kate took an increasingly active part, and her diary provides us with an inimitable record of her efforts to convert the men and women of England to the cause of votes for women. There's no other primary source that provides such a coherent picture of the life of a suffragist foot soldier. And although other suffrage diaries survive, most were written primarily because that involvement represented a singular experience, often imprisonment, a high point in the diarist's life. And Kate's diary is valuable because, writing without the benefit of hindsight, she records the inconsequential daily details of her life, both as a volunteer and later as a paid organizer. Before getting involved in the suffrage campaign, Kate had already proved herself to be rather unusual among girls of her class because, loving the theatre, she wasn't content just to sit in the audience. And when she was 24, she put herself on the other side of the footlights as an actress, travelling in touring companies around the provincial towns of Britain and Ireland. During this time, she became engaged to a fellow actor, John Collins, but it was to be a very long engagement. Acting didn't pay. Kate, I don't think, was terribly keen on marriage anyway. And after 3 years or so, Kate more or less abandoned her stage career and returned home. She'd been brought up in a politically aware household. As a teenager, when her father was an MP, she'd spent long hours in the Ladies' Gallery in the House of Commons. Often, she's even been through all-night sittings. And now that she was back home after her stint on the stage, she worked for the local Liberal candidate local candidate in North Kensington during the January 1906 general election and was elated by the Liberal landslide. Until now, she'd made little reference to the campaign to win votes for women in her diary, other than attending this North Kensington Women's Liberal Association meeting, of which her mother was president, which had been addressed by Millicent Fawcett, then the leader of the women's suffrage movement. For in the early years of the 20th century, the demand for votes for women was by no means new, of course, and I'm sure you all know this, and the campaign had been underway since 1866, but in 1903, tired of lack of progress, Mrs. Pankhurst, who was then living in Manchester and who worked for many years for various suffrage societies, took matters into her own hands and founded the WSPE, the Women's Social and Political Union. And then 2 years later, Mrs. Pankhurst's daughter Christabel and Annie Kenny, a former mill girl, shot the WSPU into the headlines when they were imprisoned after heckling Sir Edward Grey during a Liberal meeting. And the WSPU soon brought this style of militant campaigning to London, and on the 25th of April 1906, a number of WSPU members were arrested after shouting out from their seats in the Ladies' Gallery in the House of Commons. And the next day, Kate reported in her diary that during her mother's Women's Liberals social evening, quote, "There was a little discussion of what took place in the House last night, the disgraceful disturbance kicked up by some women during the women's suffrage debate. It really was awfully comical. No one showed any sense of humour." From now on, Kate did take notice of the increasingly newsworthy suffrage campaign, and during the next 4 years became more deeply involved in an entirely voluntary capacity. However, she wasn't a militant suffragette, but a member of the Central Society for Women's Suffrage, one of the constituents of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And Kate's involvement with the suffrage campaign began with acting as a steward at this meeting here. That was her first meeting of the Kensington branch of the Central Society, of which her friends Alexandra and Gladys Wright were very active honorary officials. So on the 3rd of December, she went with her sister Agnes to Kensington Town Hall, and their function was to collect money. In the gallery first, then later I was stationed to get the people as they came out. It was very amusing, really. I got so hot and excited, off my head with it. We certainly are in the thick of things. Some of the people gave a lot, others shook their heads and frowned. One man said I wanted too much to marry as well as a vote. I had quite a flirtation on the stairs with a big, smart young man. I'm afraid I felt I was more like a helper at a bazaar than at so grave a thing as a women's suffrage meeting. But I am in earnest. I really do feel a great belief in the need of the vote for women, if only as a means of education. But we are coming along, and not slowly by any means. Of course, all these rowdy attacks on the ministers and these imprisonments have sounded coarse and unpleasant, and the jokery made of it most bad for the cause, but women have waited patiently. The sort of women who have gone for the matter in this rowdy method are not the best educated or most refined amongst our members. At this meeting, everything passed off in a most orderly, dignified spirit. As Kate remarked, being a member of the Constitutional Society was not unlike being a helper at a bazaar. For ever since the campaign began in 1866, while their leaders attempted to influence politicians in whichever way was thought likely to be effective at the time, members of the suffrage societies were mainly called upon to act as fundraisers. Like all young women of her class, Kate had had plenty of experience of attending bazaars. although the Friars didn't otherwise involve themselves in philanthropic work. At these suffrage meetings, the stewards, as at any bazaar, were required only to be pleasant-looking and charming, as Kate wrote a couple of months later of another meeting. There really wasn't much to do. Run about and look busy, decorated with badges, show people into their seats, and afterwards collect. But things were changing. At the end of 1907, Kate felt the effects of the backlash caused by the WSPU's militant campaigning. Suffrage meetings were now the target for disruption. Troublemakers didn't bother to differentiate between the constitutional and militant societies, and gently brought up young women such as Kate were now faced with scenes that they would never have expected to encounter. On the 5th of December 1907, Kate wrote in her diary, "At 7 o'clock went to Paddington Baths for the London Society's meeting for women's suffrage. Gladys and Alexandra have been weeks getting it up, and I did no end of clerical work for it. We were the first stewards to arrive and were decorated with rosettes and given our directions. The place was soon hot, bubbling over with excitement, and I had my work cut out, keeping gangways clear and looking after people. We had an expected and exciting evening, but this realised our worst expectations. It was bedlam let loose. A couple of 100 students from St Mary's and University College hospitals arrived and assisted in sitting together, and never ceased all the evening singing, shouting, blowing tin trumpets, letting off crackers, letting loose mice, and what is worse, scenting the floor with the most terrible smelling chemical. Mrs Fawcett was in the chair, and Lady Grove and others spoke, and they went on with the meeting to the bitter end, and bitter it must have been to the speakers. I never heard a word. I felt too angry to be frightened, though I must own I didn't like the fireworks and saw the most appalling possibilities in that frantic howling mob of mad animals. However, despite this experience, Kate continued to steward when asked, not only for the London Society, as the Central Society had been renamed, but also for the Actresses Franchise League, because, of course, having been an actress, she saw herself very much still as part of the profession. These meetings very much appealed to Kate, held as they were in the heart of Theatreland, in the glamorous surroundings of the Criterion restaurant, allowing her an opportunity to meet many of the actresses whom she admired, as well as some of those with whom she had once worked. And it was not only for meetings in public halls that Kate's services as a steward were requested. She was also asked to attend private drawing room meetings, giving her the opportunity to enjoy glamorous interiors and engage with people outside her usual friendship circle. On the 14th of March 1907, she wrote, "Changed my dress after lunch and went to Mrs Hilton Dale's house in Onslow Gardens to a women's suffrage meeting. Such a lovely house, a beautiful tea, everything so nice, and a glorious room upstairs for the meeting, and it was packed. Such a rich, fashionable, beautifully dressed audience for the most part. I was most busy getting signatures before the meeting began, and after it was over, Gladys and I collected. It didn't really seem to matter asking those rich people to give. It was a most interesting meeting, such an unusual class of people." Involvement in the suffrage campaign was widening Kate's horizons, even affording her the occasional glimpse of genteel Bohemia. For instance, on the 9th of February 1909, went in the evening to Bedford Gardens, that's in Camden Hill, Miss Luxmore's studio, to a suffrage meeting. Myra Luxmore was an artist. I've did a little bit of research, and there's a piece about her on my blog. Got there in a good time and started to work at once stewarding and trying to make converts. Got a young man student to join the men's league. Very much enjoyed the meeting and the suffrage atmosphere, and meeting all those students was like a page out of a book. But a rattling purse wielded by a becoming steward was only one way of collecting money. For instance, what could be more agreeable and supportive than buying a ticket for a fundraising suffrage dance? Kate attended one such, organised by the NUS in January 1908 at the Grafton Gallery, allowing her the opportunity of showing off her new white satin dress. I did my hair Greek fashion with a silver and turquoise band around it, which I have made myself. It was a great pack, too many people for dancing in comfort. Some were about 300, and they have made for the London Society for Women's Suffrage about £70. We stayed to the bitter end, and I danced every dance. I learnt to do the two-step with Mr. Stanger and loved it. Mr. Stanger was North Kensington's Liberal MP at the time, and his women's suffrage bill was about to receive its second reading before, like most all the others, failing by the wayside. And the following March, Kate was flattered by an invitation to join the committee that was organising another London Society dance, which when it took place in June, she reported was a huge success. As a member of this committee, she'd been able to dispense some patronage, inviting one of her wealthy relations, one of the few who was sufficiently enlightened as to support the idea of votes for women, to be a patroness of the ball. It was only through her suffrage involvement that Kate was able to wield even such mild influence. Apart from these rather conventional methods, she was in addition able to make her own distinctive contribution to suffrage fundraising. For as a young woman, Kate had been unable to offer the usual musical accomplishments as after-dinner entertainment. She left the piano playing and singing to her sister, and instead she developed a rather more unusual skill, fortune-telling, with a speciality in reading palms. As a suffrage volunteer, Kate found that this was an accomplishment that was much in demand in fundraising fairs. For instance, on the 15th of April 1909, she went to the Caxton Hall to this fair that you see her diary entry here. She wasn't a member of the Women's Freedom League, but news of her willingness to participate had obviously reached the ears of the organisers. It was all about as funny as anything I've ever done, and I've had some experiences. I was alone at it all afternoon from 3 till 5:45 up in the gallery. I was left at it with sometimes just a few minutes in between. It must have told 40 hands. It was very interesting and the whole, I think, successful. She palmisted it at many other suffrage events, enjoying the theatricality of this role. For Kate loved to be a centre of attention, and naturally was only too delighted to take part in the spectacular processions that became so much part of the suffrage campaign. Not that the participants in the first could have envisaged just how glorious these would become, for the very first formal procession organised by the London Constitutional Society was quickly known as the Mud March, because it took place on an inhospitable 1907 February day, just before the opening of the new session of Parliament. For the women taking part, a public procession through the London streets was an entirely new experience. Kate had been thrilled to be among the crowds witnessing various royal weddings, Queen Victoria's jubilees, her funeral procession, and the return of the London contingents from the Boer War, but had never expected to be on display herself in such a way. She described the scene. The crowds to see us, the man in the street, the men in the clubs, interested, surprised for the most part, not much joking at our expense and no roughness. The policemen were splendid and all the traffic was stopped our way. We were an imposing spectacle, all with badges, each section under its own banner. Ours got broken, poor thing. I felt like a martyr of old and walked proudly along. I would not jest with the crowd. It did seem an extraordinary walk, and it took some time as we went very slowly. But we kept in one long, unbroken procession. There were about 3,000, I believe. The mud was awful. Agnes and I wore galoshes, so our feet were all right, but we got dreadfully splashed. A band was playing merrily all the time. The following year, 1908, the new WSS held another great procession, but this time wisely chose a June Saturday. Went up to London, she was staying at Bourne End at the time, wearing my decorations, my Votes for Women disc, my National Union suffrage brooch, and my red and white ribbon, the one that went through the exciting evening at the Paddington Bars. I wore them all day, and it was most amusing to see the looks given to them. During the procession, she carried one of the banners, specially designed for the occasion by the Women's Suffrage Artists League, remarking, "It was only right a Fry should be the banner bearer for North Kensington, and I loved to do it and felt very proud." Of course, the procession was a very different thing from last year, gigantic in comparison. I think it must have been rather a stirring sight. It seemed to me magnificent. I felt it was moving the people. In fact, in this is a photograph from the Women's Library, and the high banner is North Kensington, and Kate may be hidden behind the homemakers one, but we don't know. Anyway, if it had seemed unthinkable, and in a way that would have seemed unthinkable a few years earlier, one day in March 1909, Kate, as a suffrage volunteer, took to the streets in another capacity. For with Alexandra Wright, she went off by tube to Chancery Lane, where we unpacked our bundle of leaflets and stood for nearly an hour just outside the tube exit, giving them away as hard as we could. It was curious work, and a bitter wind blew on us, but the men were really quite nice, and we had no unpleasant experience. I suppose people are getting used to suffragettes. It was exciting work, really, but not so bad as we had anticipated. In fact, she mentioned she saw one of her wealthy young male cousins, and he blushed, and she thought, oh, well, there goes any more chance of going to the opera with him. Anyway, in the following year, in November 1910, Kate took a pitch at Piccadilly Circus. I mean, this isn't her, but this is just, what it was like standing there. Perhaps the most notorious place in all of London for a woman to stand alone. As she reported, I stood at the tube station curb giving away the suffrage notices. Got there about 4:30, and of course at 5 and after the street was packed with matinee folks, but it was hard to interest the ladies. The men took them, but oh, the uncaring women, and it is they who must be roused. One or two people came and spoke to me, a lady from New Zealand, quite delighted and eager to help. One man, very splendid, thought there was something in it, women of property and all that. I said it was we working women I wanted it for. Well, you're working deuced hard this afternoon, aren't you? So I thought we'd better close the conversation. Before her involvement with suffrage, Kate had mentioned how careful a young woman had to be when walking around the Piccadilly area, and had recorded several occasions when she was followed, not daring even to pause to look in shop windows in case she might be thought to be encouraging. And now here she was, at the epicentre of wickedness, actually standing and importuning passers-by. And albeit in a very much more sheltered way, Kate's experience of political persuasion had dated back to the 1890s, for on occasions when her father was a parliamentary candidate, she had in a minor way been involved in his campaign. She'd stuffed envelopes that appeared as a decorative addition on platforms when he was speaking or was chairing a meeting. And on polling day had done a bit to round up potential voters. And at the 1906 general election and during the 1907 LCC elections, Kate had again worked for the Liberals. But in the subsequent elections in January and December 1910, she refused to campaign for the Liberals, much to her father's displeasure. For her, the appeal of suffrage now took precedence over party. Thus, on January the 10th, 1910, at 11 o'clock started my suffrage canvassing for the petition to be sent up to the House of Commons. I mean, this was to be signed by male voters saying they wanted votes for women. Amusing but tiring work, and I only got 5 signatures and nearly one whole side of Cornwall Road. However, I suppose that's better than might have been, and most of the people were very nice and polite, and I got through a lot of talking. She continued in this way, canvassing for the petition, handing out leaflets and attempting to entice passers-by into meetings, commenting, "It is all most amusing work, but I'm afraid I have not much faith in any of it." Because the local Liberal candidate had refused to support votes for women, their new WSS was campaigning against him, as were the WSPU, who as a matter of policy always campaigned against the Liberal, regardless of his attitude to suffrage, in the hope of teaching the government a lesson. Or, I mean, the utmost in bringing down the government. I don't think there was ever really much hope of that. On polling day, Kate was directed to a local polling station. Got there just after 8 o'clock to find the suffragettes, that is the WSPU, already picketed outside. I collected a good many signatures between 8:30 and 10:30, nearly all unionist signatures, as the Liberals are so furious that the suffragettes are here working against the government candidate, and they cannot and will not unmix our two societies. Several men she knew refused, none too politely, to sign the petition. It only makes me keener on suffrage and less keen on liberalism, which will not consider us apart from the work we do for them. It has come to me that I shall never work for party again until women get the vote. The Liberal candidate was defeated in North Kensington, whether or not due to the efforts of Kate and her fellow workers. 1910 then saw a step change in Kate's involvement with suffrage. Soon after the January election, Alexander and Gladys Wright were among those who broke away from the NUWSS and formed a new society, the New Constitutional Society for Women's Suffrage. As the name suggests, they upheld constitutional methods of campaigning, but thought the NUWSS was not sufficiently proactive. The NCS's by-election policy was, like the WSPU, to campaign against the government, that is, the Liberal candidate. Although Kate had not joined the NCS immediately on its formation, she too had moved away from the NUWSS, that is, from the Constitutional Society, and after witnessing the riot in Parliament Square in November 1910, an occasion that became known as Black Friday, she had gone so far as to join the WSPU. And there's the receipt for her subscription. However, when the Wrights asked her to campaign as a volunteer for the NCS at the December 1910 general election, she agreed to do so. I've just joined the Women's Social and Political Union, but a lot of us are helping the NCS, as they are mostly very grand people and want real working helpers. So there was, I don't know, well, this actually comes out better than in reality, probably. This is a photograph taken at a by-election in Walthamstow, and this is it's the only photograph I've seen of the NCS, the New Constitutional Society, campaigning. And there was a recognised distinction between some women, the grand people, and Kate eloquently describes their furs and magnificent motors, and there's the motor. These women couldn't be asked to address envelopes or hand out leaflets, but some women, such as Kate, could. For instance, it was as a real working helper that on December the 10th, 1910, I was sent off with an armful of poles, banners and posters to the LCC schools where the 8 o'clock meeting was held. Oh my, I did have a time. Dozens of small hooligans were stationed outside the gates of the schoolyard, and I had an awful time getting to the door. They rushed me, heckled me and thumped my back, threw their caps and dirty bits of paper and mud at me and tried to get the things out of my arms. They nearly had me on my back, but I shouted them down and gained the doorway. I turned and addressed them amidst cries of, "Bring her an orange box," etc., but I made them listen and spoke straight to them and told them there was very good argument for votes for women. Experiences such as this were to stand Kate in good stead. For barely 3 weeks later, she reported that her father's finances were hopeless and that she would have to find work to support herself. Her immediate thought was, with a heavy heart, that she would have to find stage work and tout herself round all the agents. But she was saved from this by an offer from Alexander and Gladys Wright, who offered her work as paid employment as an organiser for the NCS. And on March the 5th, 1911, she reported in her diary, "I have heard I am to go suffrage campaigning in mid-Norfolk." Thus began an extraordinary new stage in Kate's involvement in the women's suffrage campaign. And it's this involvement that is included in the edited version of her diary that was published earlier this year. She was in many ways quite well equipped for her new role. As we've seen, she had by now considerable experience of suffrage meetings and of suffrage canvassing and leafleting. From her brief encounter with the stage, she was used to the business of travelling around the country, finding digs and consorting with fellow lodgers, often very odd fellow lodgers. Of her arrival in mid-Norfolk, at East Dereham, where the NCS made its local headquarters, Kate wrote, "We seem to be eyed with the greatest interest. It is a funny cross between being on a visit and a theatrical tour. I have nervousness for tomorrow's work, but is not so bad as a first night." On another occasion, arriving in Rye late on a wintry evening, she wrote in her diary, "Felt rather tired and very on tour, the Sunday night feeling in a strange town being intensified by the church bells being practised." Oh, I can just sympathise. What was different was that in her previous engagements she was a volunteer. Before 1911, whether as a suffrage campaigner or as an actress, she didn't need to work, and if she chose, could go home when she wished, decline to undertake any task that didn't appeal, and most importantly, was certain, even when handing out leaflets in Piccadilly Circus, of maintaining her class position. By becoming an employee, she was entering into unknown territory. When she had first met the Wright sisters in 1906, she was very conscious of the educational gap that separated her from them. They were both graduates, London University graduates, the first that she'd known at all intimately. But otherwise, to all intents and purposes, the Wright family and the Frys were on a similar social level, with Kate perhaps having a slight edge due to her family's high profile in local Liberal politics. Her father at this time was an alderman. However, as the Frys' financial fortunes declined and they had first to give up their large North Kensington house for a small flat, and then in 1911 retreat entirely from London to Bourne End, so the Wrights moved from a terraced house to a very much grander, stuccoed, semi-detached Notting Hill villa. Kate was only too aware of this relative change in their circumstances. Although she found no shame in either the idea of working or the actual work involved, in fact, she was proud to be thought of as a suffrage worker. She did hate being beholden for her income to the Wrights. The £2 a week she was paid seems to have been the going rate for an organiser. The WSPU paid the same. And on top of this, the NCS met at least some of her lodging and travel expenses. But Kate did resent the casual carelessness that allowed members of the committee sometimes to forget to pay small sums she was owed, the implication being that they thought them so small as to be inconsequential. And by drawing attention to her need for the money, she only accentuated the fact that she was no longer one of them. She also resented the way in which the committee would, without consulting her, change their plans for her at the last minute. On several occasions, she was forced to cancel a planned weekend at home. She had lost autonomy, but was in no position to question the committee's decisions. For by 1913, Kate's salary became an absolute necessity. Her father's affairs were so desperate, the family was forced to give up the lease on the Bourne End house, which they had held since the 1880s. All their possessions were sold at a very public auction. It was in a tent on the lawn in front of the house, where the locals had previously been given, rather grandly given tea during the regatta. Now everything was being sold. And mother, father and Agnes left for dingy rented rooms in Worthing. Frederick Fry died within a year, leaving his widow and daughters with virtually no income. Kate was too proud to ask for money for herself, but did beard the wealthiest relation. That she was related to the family of the Gilbys, W&A Gilby, which are wine and spirit merchants, extremely wealthy family. Her mother's sister was married to one of the founders. Anyway, she did beard him, and in fact, the office then, the Gilbys' office, was in the Pantheon, which is now, Marks and Spencer's Pantheon in Oxford Street. Anyway, it was there, she went there. And she did elicit a promise from him of a small income for her mother and her sister for 5 years, but she steadfastly said that she didn't require anything from them. And she had her £2 a week to live on. And how did the work of a paid organiser differ from that of a volunteer? Well, at heart the purpose was much the same, to drum up interest in the suffrage cause. But Kate was now no longer mistress of her destiny and was sent hither and thither around the country at the behest of the NCS committee. Her first engagement was, as she mentioned, in mid-Norfolk, and one can't help but wonder, as did Kate, why East Dereham, a small, insignificant market town, was selected by the NCS as the territory on which to concentrate their slender resources, and she was their slender resources. Years ago, while compiling my reference guide to the suffrage movement, I'd wondered why East Dereham was one of the few places where the NCS had a local society, rather than, say, Manchester or Bristol or any other place of consequence. Anyway, now we know it was merely because it was to there that Kate Fry had been sent. She then diligently brought together a few local women. There were very few who were interested, and set up the society. From this base, Kate's work was to organise numerous meetings in the small towns and villages of central and north Norfolk. The meetings were attended by speakers sent down by headquarters. Some of these speakers were quite unsuitable. For instance, in 1912, at a meeting in Burnham Market, I don't know who else knows Burnham Market, very small place, yes. Anyway, you have suffrage meetings there. Kate recorded, "I could see at once Miss Hessel was no good. When she got up, the crowd streamed off in a long procession. Oh, the agony. She read poetry very badly for the first 10 minutes. In fact, dealing with speakers selected by the Society, some of whom were of the magnificent lady class, while others were hired professionals, was one of the heaviest crosses that Kate had to bear. A particular bête noire was a Mrs. Merivale Mayor, who, although Kate acknowledged her to be an excellent speaker, proved to be very difficult in person. In May 1913, when based in Dover, Kate records the arrival of Mrs. Mayor. She arrived in a temper, wanted food not having had lunch, such nonsense. She should have got something on the train, she came by boat express. We had a nice gathering, made some members, and Mrs. Mayor ought to have been glad and helpful instead of full of grumbles. Why had she been sent to Dover? Such nonsense, etc., etc. I could have slain her, and she got on my nerves to a horrible extent. It was the most tremendously exciting moment in London, desperate doings in the suffrage world, and for free speech and for a free press. But if the committee decide Miss Mayor is to go into the country, she ought to come and behave decently. This is May 1914, it was just when, May 1913, it was, things were hotting up. And once headquarters had let her know that a speaker was coming on a certain day, it was up to Kate to find a suitable venue. Besides Dereham, she spent lengthy periods in the Folkestone Dover area and in Reading and all around, and became well acquainted with all the local public halls. Then once a hall had been hired, she had the difficult task of finding a suitable chairman. The first port of call was generally a local vicar, who very often proved reluctant. In fact, Kate became very despondent about the church's attitude to the suffrage campaign. One diary entry made in Reading in 1913 reads, "Out till 7 calling, 4 vicars. Came in very depressed. They're an awful lot." Failing the church, she would turn to a local social leader, although social eminence by no means went hand in hand with suffrage sympathy. When a promised chairman reneged on the day of a Folkestone meeting, Kate describes how in desperation she approached the wife of the commandant at Shorncliffe Army Camp. "I found her very nice, but she had to consult her husband." These women weren't free. "So I went back at 2 when she told me she would take the chair, and I had coffee with her and it was introduced to her husband. Oh dear, it was all such a strain." She was feeling particularly plain that day. I think the putative chairman woman was very well dressed. Large parts of a day could be taken up with such a task. The date, the speaker, the chairman and the venue having been decided, Kate had then to compose the wording for a poster and or for a leaflet and engage a printer. And these are some, her diary is packed with some of these flyers. They're very scarce and unusual. Then she had to hire a bill sticker to put up posters around the town and herself sit down with a local directory to write out envelopes in which to send out leaflets to those she hoped would attend. She would then spend days canvassing, trying to elicit interest in the meeting. Naturally, if a speaker came down from London and found a half-empty hall, it was Kate who shouldered the blame. Some meetings were successful. Of one of the first she organised in Dereham, Kate wrote, "We opened the doors at 7:20 and in very little time the place was full. I had to stand at the door and kept the youths and maidens out till the police officer arrived and then went up to sell literature." The meeting was held in a big room on the first floor. Such a splendid meeting, hundreds turned away, packed hall and 90 people of the right sort. And it was, of course, quite important to get the right sort because very often they weren't. The speaker had been Mrs. Chapman, who was the president of the new Constitutional Society, so Kate was very relieved, particularly as that afternoon only 2 women had turned up to a suffrage tea party she'd organised. I think she'd been expecting 14, or at least 14 had said they'd come, and then only 2. She spent a great deal of time canvassing, knocking on doors, trying to engage the locals in discussions about votes for women. In the first week or so of her engagement in Dereham, she wrote, folded up bills and meeting, etc., then went out canvassing for Wednesday. Didn't do badly, I suppose, but the people don't seem to feel it was vital. I don't think, it's very sleepy, dear. 3 years later, working in Reading, this was her comment, canvassed Caversham Road in the morning and bawled at people in their doorways as the trams clanged past. Then canvassed Wokingham Road from 3:30 to 6. Oh, doesn't it sound tiring? Interestingly, although when Kate had been a daughter at home, she had frequently complained of feeling ill, seedy was the word, and thought nothing of spending days in bed. Now that she had work to do, she makes far fewer such complaints. Even when she does feel ill, she usually soldiers on. And it must have been a strain for a woman who had always been able to retreat when she chose into the privacy of her own room, with servants to attend her, to have to live in public in the often sordid life, leading the often sordid life of a lodger. There was a lot of complaints about baths and not having enough hot water and the state of the bath, etc. Occasionally she was able to stay in a hotel, but more often than not, when she arrived in a new town, her first task was to tramp the streets in the search for suitable digs. But within a few months of beginning life as an employee, Kate was prepared to follow even the most outré of her society's instructions. She describes how, campaigning at Lowestoft, she and 2 other NCS women donned our posters, and very trim and nice we looked, 2 in green linen and 1 in cream linen, with the large double-cross bills sewn onto stiff brown paper. I think this is I think it must be a poster with Asquith, a double-faced Asquith. There was a Votes Women paper cartoon. Anyway, they mounted this onto stiff paper and tied them round their necks with green ribbon. Green and cream was the NCS colours. I went first. We walked all down the main road to the pier, stood there while the people were coming off, then along South Parade and back up to the main road. And she mentions later in that day's diary entry of all the chaff they got from various young men, students she calls them. You know, if they're quite nice and young, she usually thinks they're students. However, although she became increasingly confident about canvassing, organising and publicising meetings, dealing with difficult individuals and even parading the streets, and was quite happy to discuss suffrage informally, for many years she felt too nervous to undertake public speaking, and this despite the fact of her years on the stage. However, in the end, she even gave in on this and reluctantly agreed to address a few meetings. This is 1914, and you can see her there halfway down, June the 9th. She's talking about barmaids. Of one of the first meetings that she addressed, it was at Ashford in Kent in November 1912, she wrote, "I nearly died when my moment came, but I heard my clear, cold voice ringing out, 'Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, there is one sentence above every other which stands out to me in that wonderful, impressive address we've been listening to here tonight, and that sentence is, pray that she died soon. And it's because we women suffragists refuse any longer to have to say that of one of our sisters that I am here tonight.'" Anyway, so it's quite dramatic. And she carries on saying, and I spoke on for about 10 minutes. It was not altogether what I could have wished, but I think it is the best I've done. And I heard dramatic effects in my voice, and it went down well. But it isn't worth it to me. I've never felt so dreadful before over anything. There is nothing to take it off while one's on the platform just waiting. And that hall that she spoke in Ashford is actually now underneath the international terminal. So as you go past on Eurostar, you can think of her clear, cold voice ringing out dramatically there. She was encouraged by the reception she got that evening and a few other meetings, and she did attend speakers' classes, because the suffrage societies did put on classes where people could practice and take tips on speaking. And as you see by the autumn of 1914, she was on the NCS list of speakers. For Kate did continue working for the NCS even after the outbreak of war. For the society, like the NCS, like the other suffrage societies, abandoned out-and-out campaigning, at this point anyway, campaigning for the vote, and instead, as their contribution to the war effort, opened a workroom on their premises, employing dressmakers laid off by traditional garment manufacturers. And Kate was put in charge of the workroom and became secretary. I mean, this is paid secretary, not the on-secretary of the NCS. She was now living in digs in Pimlico with no prospect of a family home. So in January 1915, she finally married John Collins. And it was her decision. They were on a train and she decided that the time had come that they would have to get married. Also, he was now an army officer and his earnings were rather greater than they'd been as an actor. However, so they married in January, but however, her war work came to abrupt end that summer. She was on there was a big march that was organised by Mrs. Pankhurst and Lloyd George, the Right to Work march, and she was a steward on that. It was on a rainy day in July, I think. But after that, it was the holidays, and she went away, and she was struck down by some mystery illness. I never quite know about these illnesses. It certainly seemed very real to her, but now I can't help thinking, with John's salary standing between her and destitution, there wasn't perhaps the same necessity for her to earn her living. And certainly she was never again in paid employment, except for a brief return in the early 1930s, and it was really for pleasure as an actress on tour with her husband's company. Although John and Kate had very little money, it was never quite so imperative that she should earn her own living as it had been in 1911. I also think that it was because she was working for what she regarded as a noble cause that Kate had found it relatively easy to become a worker. The transition to employee, even though entailing all the petty difficulties I've mentioned, was made easier because of the years she'd spent as a volunteer. She'd not only gained considerable experience of the work, but had carried into her new life the past knowledge of herself as a volunteer. This image of herself as a free worker in the cause had helped to arm her against the indignities of paid employment. Okay.
Now we have some time for discussion. Does anybody want to start us off? Yes.
I thought that was really interesting because I didn't know anything about her, but what I'm interested in is the whole form of it as a diary. So could you say something about why do you think she actually kept this diary? The extent to which was this seen as personal? Was this, and in terms of what she writes about, at that period, is it just simply around suffrage and sort of public events? And you said she kept the diary until 1958. Could you say something about the sorts of things she writes about later?
Yes, certainly. She started the diary when she was 8. Just a few entries that she copied out later when she was perhaps 12 or 13. Because from the age of 12 or 13 anyway, from about 1890, so she was 12 or so, she kept a daily diary in purpose. They weren't purpose-built diaries, though I should have brought one actually. I had rather a lot to carry today. They get progressively larger ledgers. I mean, by the time of the suffrage, the ledgers are that thick. She got them from Whiteley's. Her family was very connected with Whiteley's store. And she carted them around the country. But the early ones, they're thinner books because the entries weren't quite so long, but they're quite detailed, even from an early age, about exactly what she did every day. And at this point, I suppose when she was 12, she wasn't particularly thinking of public consumption, but by the time she was a teenager, she talked about her diary in social gatherings. I mean, it's mentioned that she's a diarist, she rather liked the idea of it. And then as she gets older, she does have musings about, what it'd be like when I look back at this diary. And it's obvious that she, from much later entries from the 20s or 30s, she does look back at the earlier ones, the ones from the 1890s, early 1900s, and thinks what a wonderful time she had then compared with the rather less interesting time she was having then. Yes, so it was very, very much part of her life. And in fact, she had made for them, I can't remember, but it was about 1907 or 8, there was a purpose-built bookcase with a lid so that fastened for the diaries. And that is specifically mentioned in her will. She didn't have much to leave in her will, but she specifically left the diaries to her main the person she was leaving what she had to, who, because she didn't have any children, was actually a son of a cousin. He didn't have any children, so they ended up, there's no contact now with any family that I can discover, because obviously for copyright reasons I had to quite diligently pursue that. Yes, so it became progressively, I would say, that it was sort of for public consumption. I think her husband probably did look at it. In the case, he might have been shocked rather at times, because she was quite sharp about him sometimes, but I don't think she actually locked it all away. So, the other thing about when the suffrage years, for this I've just extracted the suffrage material, but there's all the rest of life is there as well, and particularly because, say, when she's staying in digs, there's a lot about the other lodges, some of which is extremely interesting, but I mean the book would have just gone forever.
Can I just have a supplement? Why do you think she didn't, as many did in the 20s and 30s, then put all of this into a published autobiography?
Oh, I don't think she was conscious of it being, sufficiently interesting. She was writing plays, which she kept on trying to get published, but couldn't. But I don't think she would have thought of it. It was her companion, her friend. She wasn't doing it for to broadcast her life. By 1920 or so, or no, at 1917 or 18, she moves on to purpose-made diaries, but they're quite large then. But then by the mid-20s, they're on to smaller ones, so there's less there. But she crams quite a lot of information into them. It ends up, I was going to say, it ends up very sadly, you get a whole dementia diary, because her husband develops dementia. And, day by day, reports of those in the 50s is really quite...
You've endorsed what, for me, was the main thing that struck me about the diary, and that was the fact that it was such an awful job, or it was such an unrelenting job, in that she, both physically unrelenting, in that she'd be rushing backwards and forwards, usually in the rain, knocking on doors, going this, going that, getting the other, in the other. And it was so stressful because she was endlessly, as you said, worrying about would Mrs. So-and-so turn up? Would she find her chairman?
Yes.
Would people come?
Yes.
Would it be shaming? Would it be this?
Yeah.
Would it be that?
Yeah.
So it really was. God, she earned her £2 a week.
Yes. And there's no other diary. There's no other reports like this.
The minutiae
yes,
of
exactly.
what actually had to be done. Going to the printer, doing this, doing that, going and seeing these awful people that he had to call on all the time. I was just full of admiration for her, and she doesn't really complain about it. She does it. She just gets on with it and does it.
Well, following up on that, you talk about her mystery illness in 1915, but the very thought that you could give up would allow you to acknowledge how exhausted you were.
That's what I was really mean.
Lots of people were. Evelyn Sharp writes very well about that exhaustion that she felt afterwards, and Johanna Alberti, in that book Beyond Suffrage, talks about the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of the people who'd been in that. I also wanted to pick up on what you said about published memoirs. Apart from Ray Strachey's The Cause, the only published memoirs that I can think of in that period are wartime, the war nurses and war memoirs. All right, yes, there is Sylvia Pankhurst as well, making her claim to have been...
Yes, well, there's Evelyn Sharp. They're both biographies of her, I suppose. Yes, Lady Rhonda. yeah.
Emmeline Pethick Lawrence. There's quite
Yes,
a lot
yes.
of there.
It is, yeah.
And they
Yeah.
are the big names.
Oh yes, always the big names. Yes, yeah.
Yes, and Christabel Unshackled.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
but not the Foots.
Yeah, yeah.
Not the Foots.
Well, that's why I thought this was worth doing as a book, just for that reason.
I thought it's very interesting how you had, because I've read for my MA, I had to read a lot of the WSP autobiography, so and it's very interesting how there's how you get the picture of somebody that wasn't in the WSP, somebody that went through all of that kind of trauma and during their daily life, and they weren't in an organisation that we don't really hear about anymore.
No, exactly. Yeah, you only hear the window breaking and being in prison. Yeah. No, it's my crusade to.
The two things that interested me personally, there's the aspects around her transition from volunteering to paid work, and the first was that she doesn't really seem to be plucked out based on her skills. She's plucked out when she says, I need to leave, I need a job, and so then she's given a job. And I wonder what that says about the equality of opportunity among her and her colleagues, but moreover that when she's recognised for her skills and paid for it, it accompanies a loss in status, and she's no longer one of them. You think that being paid rather than being a volunteer would indicate that your skills are more highly prized, but it's the reverse, which I thought was really interesting as well.
Yes, I think that's well, I suppose, I mean, the things went hand in hand. I mean, it was because she had to be employed, it was because the family's fortunes had gone down, so she'd lost status that way. That sort of dovetails with then being an employee, so it's a sort of double whammy. But the WSP organisers as well, I mean, they had no training, they were just chucked into it.
Was she unique in her position, or were there others doing the same job and also being paid?
Oh, yes.
Did they all get them just by knowing people and being asked to do this and given a wage?
Wait a moment, that excellent reference to bazaars. Now, you said that the Fry family weren't much into it, but they were in the Liberal Party, and her father was an MP. And I just wonder how many women had never organised a meeting of women of that class.
Well, her mother had these at-homes, every month for the North Kensington Women's Liberal Association. Very ill-attended, I think, but they were used to organising things in that way, and they would have. They were philanthropic. I mean, I wouldn't really call it that, but I mean, they did have liberals and temperance people came down to Bourne End and went out on the river on their boats and that kind of thing, but it wasn't actually, working charitably, particularly. But I suppose I mean, she was sort of plunged into it, organising meetings, but I suppose it's common sense to a large extent.
It's common sense, and people did it a lot because they didn't have television, or
exactly.
People liked going to.
And she always kept accounts, her own accounts. Even before she was working, she would, when she was on the stage, laid into the diary accounts. How much she'd paid for the digs, and so she was used to making reports in that way. That she had kept an organiser's notebook, which has now been acquired by the Women's Library, so they have got some NCS material now, and you can follow. And that's just so instead of a diary entry, it's just a couple of lines for a day saying what she did. She obviously had to go to the committee.
I was fascinated by your talk, and thank you very much. I'm interested in the moment, the ambivalence about paid work. I think it's so interesting. It's clearly from the late 19th century. Those governesses who were sent out, it were very much the GPI and all that. That was against the grain, really, wasn't it? I'm wondering when this position changed. It always struck me in Jane Eyre that, Jane leaves the school, right? As soon as she marries, she leaves the school. And our expectation that paid work is, laudable. I'm just wondering, do you think that the women who went to the early women's colleges, like Newnham and Girton and Somerville and so on, do you think they had a different attitude to
Oh, I think so, because it was professional. I mean, that was the whole point, I've written about the Garrett family, and they were part of a movement to make women's work professional, or whatever it was. So it might be teaching, or even housekeeping, or interior design, but you have a training and a professional, and therefore you can maintain your status. Whereas this kind of work's really sort of clerical, it's sort of rather in between. But I think because it was for, as I say, a noble cause, it softened the blow. It wasn't as though she was actually working in a commercial concern.
But, I've done work on the early teachers, tutors, lecturers in Somerville. Right, and so you have the lady warden, right, of the upper classes, Shaw Lefebvre, and then you have the teachers, and they are regarded as, doing clerical work, and my impression of that first generation is that they didn't actually like their work.
Actually, Martha Vicinas,
Yes,
in Independent Women, she has a chapter on Somerville.
yes.
I'm pretty sure it is Somerville, and she says, some people went up there and it was known that they were going to have to be teachers and earn their living afterwards, and they were a different group, literally a class apart from the ones who were going there to improve their minds and perhaps marry intellectuals.
Yeah, but I think if one's talking about teachers, one needs to differentiate between those who have degrees and would be working in the what were then independent schools, and those who were working, say, in the elementary schools. And there's certainly, when I've written stuff before about feminist teachers or something, is the fact that there were many who then went, say, to be organisers in the WSPU had a teaching background, and one certainly gets the impression that they do anything to get out of the classroom. And that even those who are very active in, say, the National Federation of Women Teachers and then the NUWT, a lot of that is around the political organisation they're interested in, rather than the teaching. So like the secretary of the NUWT, Ethel Froud, was never interested in teaching. She was then a political organiser, she then got this job. So I think they're different, as you're implying, they're different sort of layers of this. And if you were a lowly person, like as an elementary school teacher, you did want something different.
My grandparents lived about the same time in North Kensington,
Oh, yes.
in Oxford Gardens.
Oh, yes.
From about 1900 right up until the 1950s.
Yeah. Well, the Frys lived in Arundel Gardens, which must be, it's just off, is it off Kensington Park Road? I mean, it's up there anyway,
Yeah. Two things that came down to me as a grandson. My grandfather was apparently quite interested in Lloyd George at that time. And also there was this very class-divided society among women. And it centred on a church, Christ Church, Lancaster Gate.
Oh, yes,
Which was Sir John French used to worship there.
Oh, yes. Well, in fact, Kate Fry, I've just this morning was doing her 1891 diary, reading it, and in fact she mentions going to Christ Church, Lancaster Gate. It wasn't their usual church, but anyway, they happened to have gone there. It's the reason I was looking at the diary was because you'll be able to find out more about Kate Fry, because I've just been commissioned by the publishing arm of ITV, to write her life story based on the book, to be published as an e-book. Anyway, so...
well, I hope you'll be paid more than £2 a week.
Marginally. probably much the same if you work it out, yes.
Yeah. I mean, as I'm sure you obviously know, at this time there was a whole lot of pressure groups, tariff reform, National Service League, Free Trade, Navy League, etc. etc. was she aware of these other
Oh, absolutely.
campaigning groups?
Yes.
Did they come, sort of
Yes,
come
they would
together,
come
or were they all
together.
totally separate, going their own ways and not looking at anybody else?
Well, she occasionally meets them, and she's very flirtatious, really, anyway. And she says, sometimes I could flirt with a broomstick. And it was the insurance bill lecturer that she came across in Norfolk. They had a nice few chats, and she met him again in Reading a couple of years later. And, going around, particularly at election time, and then the Irish, there'd be campaigners, Home Rulers. Yes, so they were very aware of it was just as a matter of course. I mean, it wasn't, doesn't remark on them as anything extraordinary. It was just, she was trying to work out, it wasn't a commercial traveller, she thought, but couldn't work out exactly what, might this man in the dining room might be in the hotel. And
Can I ask another question just quickly? I'm puzzled, why didn't she go to a school? I mean, because there were, as we all know, there were quite a lot of very good...
Oh, yes, very good. There was...
Yes,
it's Kensington High.
Yeah.
And in fact, Alexandra and Gladys Wright went to Kensington High. No, she had... that was just obviously what her parents decided. They had... I think some of the lessons might have been from her mother, but probably not. But they were mainly governesses, and for this further work, I've been sort of working out who the teachers were, and one was a woman who came up from Maidenhead. Obviously, she didn't have quite so far to travel when they were at Bourne End, but she would come up to London on a season ticket daily, and there would be just lessons in the morning. Probably it was only a couple of hours, I expect, and then they might with the governess. She's never referred to as a governess. It's just her name that's given. And in fact, Kate keeps in touch with her all her life. Eventually, the governess actually married, in her late 30s, she married a man who became a teacher at St Paul's. And Kate keeps in touch with her all her life. And there's a reference to her no will.
Thank you.
Just on that, yes, there were schools in North Kensington, but actually, thinking on some work I've been doing on the family of Samuel Montague, and there were a lot of very clever daughters, and they went to Dorset College, but only for a couple of years. It was the idea of rigorous long-term schooling for your girls.
Yeah, no, and after the education, whatever. I don't know what the education consisted of. She certainly writes well, but that was perhaps self-taught. I don't know. The governess, the main one, was called Miss Cox. What Miss Cox taught her, I don't know. After that stopped, before she was 16, there were it was a short period of lessons from a mademoiselle, French, and her sister had quite intensive piano, music and violin lessons, singing lessons, because she was musical the Fries. There was a musical strain. Actually, it's quite interesting because it contrasts their cousins that she was... Kate had no real close girl friends when she was a teenager, except for her sister and two cousins. And the cousins were orphans and lived with other relations. And one of them, they were a bit older than her. One of them was a violinist who went round the country in ladies' orchestras playing at the Gaiety, restaurant, various places. And the other one wanted to become a writer and had a lot of things published in magazines and things, but then did publish quite a few novels, Edwardian novels. So there was a contrast then. There was Kate not having to work, and yet being very friendly with these cousins who came and stayed and came and went, who really did have to do it. And the one who was a writer worked as a governess, a daily governess. Yeah.
I'm quite curious. So she finished her suffrage work in 1914 or 1915, but her diaries go to 1958. So what occupied her time until 1958?
Writing the diaries.
Because she didn't work, and she...
Oh, no, she didn't work. No, it was just...
was she a lady of leisure? Was she having...
Well, I wouldn't say it was leisure, because I don't know. Well, I suppose she was always busy. But then, I mean, everything seemed to take, I mean, so much housework, so much. Of course, she had to do all the housework and cooking by then. They'd a woman to do the heavy, but...
Did she volunteer again?
No, nothing at all. There was a lot of concern with health and just... Anyway, yes, it fills the time, but... and her husband's working with at Stratford for a bit of several years. I mean, the summer season, so she goes to Stratford. And there's, but she doesn't like that because they're living in lodgings. Yes, yes, in more digs. Yes, I mean, it wasn't a very enjoyable life, but it's that period. But it's interesting to see it. And then, of course, there's the Second World War to liven things up. And
No children?
no job, no children, no. And I've been trying to work out whether this was intentional. I don't think it was intentional particularly, but anyway, no children.
Well, how old was she when she married?
Married, so 1915, 37, so yes.
Oh, well, that is quite late
Late,
to
yeah,
try
yeah,
to start
yeah,
a family,
yeah.
isn't it?
Yes, I think that she's not terribly discreet about things but I got a hint that there had been one time when she thought she might be pregnant and then was disappointed, but well, at least she doesn't say disappointed, but it wasn't.
Does she say anything about women getting the vote?
Oh yes, yes, oh yes. It's all in the book. Yes, well, she follows it all right
She
through.
does, she
Yes,
follows.
she goes to Mrs. Pankhurst's funeral. She's in St John Smith Square, the funeral. She goes to the cemetery and sees Mrs. Pankhurst laid into the earth. Yes, and then that was the end of her involvement. Really, then yes.
She did in fact end up voting, didn't she?
Sorry?
She did go and cast a vote, didn't she?
Oh yes. Although the very first election, the 1918 one, there was no candidate. She was then living in Buckinghamshire in the sort of grace and favour house of the cottage of the Gilbys, and that because of the sort of coupon election, this was a constituency where there was nobody put up against the sitting candidate, but he was probably Conservative. So she didn't get a chance to vote at that first one. But as soon as she could, she voted. She always voted. Yeah, but it became progressively more. She stopped being a Liberal and became a Conservative. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm reminded by what you said that there is a thread that runs through the history of the women's movement, by which I mean the women's organisations that came out of the 19th century, whereby the elected, the toffs, the grand ladies, who are the president or the chairman, etc., boss the paper.
Yes.
And there's the girl in the office who, however able she may be, is actually bossed around.
Yes.
Given no agency and so on, and all the decisions are made by the committee and so on. And it's interesting that organisations that campaigned for women's employment rights are actually, and I mean this does just carry on even to this day, are actually going bad employers themselves.
Yes. Yes.
Well, perhaps we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.